Thanks so much for coming on the ArtStops today. My name is Lucy Eron. I'm a museum educator. We're in the Piranesi exhibition, which just recently opened. It's called Piranesi Rome and the Arts of Design. I know this is a slightly awkward space, so if you just can find a spot and bear with us here. This is a very unique exhibition if you have not already seen it. It's huge, and it covers a lot of Piranesi's broad scope of work throughout his career. He was an artist, he was an etcher, an engraver, an architect, a designer. So I encourage you to look throughout this exhibition after this art stop and see more of his works. But today we're going to focus on just one thing in particular, because in 15 minutes we can't really touch on everything. So today I will focus on his ruins and how he incorporated the ruin or the fragment into his ideology. So Piranesi was from Italy, and he was actually a Venetian, but he was so taken with Rome that he just ensconced himself there for most of his life. And he only left once, really, and that was because he ran out of money, as was the case for many young artists, and he had to go home to Venice. But otherwise, he just lived and worked in Rome, and he was, again, really taken by Rome and the ruins that were surrounding him. And he really popularized, at the time, the use of the ruins and antiquity. And as we'll see, he really created a comment on the ruin and on antiquity with his own ideological slant. So the ruin is something very powerful that you can use as an artist to create this kind of emotional response. So this exhibition, again, marks that fascination with the ruins that was happening, and largely due to Piranesi. And one critic wrote of him, and I'll read you this critic's quote. They said, quote, "Piranesi infected the great public with a taste of ruins that was hitherto limited to just a few artists and poets." So before Piranesi, this was not common. So he really was a driving force in this development of this taste for ruins in the 18th century in Europe. And it came at a good time because the Enlightenment was underway, and so there was overall just an interest in classical antiquity and science. So he's investigating that through the artist's lens. And he, again, fueled this concept of a grand Roman legacy, and really was the driving force behind this image of Rome as a tragic, beautiful, legacy. So these works right here, and we're going to start here and then move into the next room, but these are the title pages from the Veduti di Roma, which is the views of Rome. And I just chose these as a starting point because I think they demonstrate Piranesi's incorporation of fantasy and ruins. And in this one right here, this is the title page that incorporates Minerva. And if you get to take a closer look later, Minerva is this figure right here in the center. And she was the Roman equivalent of Athena, which was the Greek goddess of war and also of the arts and wisdom. So he puts that right in the title page. So automatically he's already commenting on the use of Roman legend. There was a debate at the time between what was superior with the Greek and Roman history and architecture in particular. And he, of course, felt that Rome was superior. So throughout his works, you will see the emphasis on Rome and classical beauty in Rome. So he saw many of these art objects that you see throughout his work. He saw them at the newly opened museum, archaeological museum in Rome, in which many of these antiquities were displayed. But he also went to the actual sites where he created many of these etchings and did a series of sketches. So he did a lot of sketches from direct observation. And at the time, that was not so simple. So some of these ruins were very inaccessible. So he had to, hike in a lot of times. He went to Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were just newly discovered outside of Naples. And he was just fascinated by that. And if you've ever been, it's really, you can just kind of get yourself involved in this sense of whimsy, like as if you lived during that time. The streets are just miraculously preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius. The entire communities, Roman communities, were actually buried in ash. So he visited these archaeological sites and was just in awe of these ruins. And also in Rome. So the Roman Forum, he spent a lot of time sketching there, and back then, in the mid-18th century, was not what it's like now, which is very touristy, a lot of people. So it was actually a little bit more atmospheric during that time. And he would go and sketch there, and supposedly this is where he met his wife, who appeared in the Roman Forum, and she looked, according to Piranesi, like the classical Roman beauty. And allegedly he had romance right there on the spot, and they were married. So I think he was very nostalgic, very romantic sensibility to Piranesi. And we can see that reflected in his work. He also expressed a desire to preserve ruins. So I'll read you a quote of his, which I think, this is Piranesi, in Piranesi's voice. He said, quote, "When I realized that in Rome, the majority of the ancient monuments were lying forsaken in fields or gardens, or even now serving as a quarry for new structures, I resolved to preserve their memory with the help of my engravings. I have therefore attempted to exercise the greatest possible exactitude." So he asserts that he's trying to be useful here and preserve the memory of these antiquities and these ruins. But the greatest possible exactitude, as we'll see, is not necessarily always the case with his work. So in a way, this was true because, basically a third of the artifacts and the ruins that are in his etchings here either no longer exist, disappeared, they modified, they were changed over time. So in a way, there is a lot of truth to that because he actually is preserving the vision of these artifacts. But on the other hand, the fact that there's so much fantasy involved in his work. So we're not seeing accurate depictions in most of these, in fact, in any of these engravings. They're all imbued with a sense of fantasy and changed according to his vision. These ones very clearly so. These are totally fantasy. I mean, they look as if they're, a graveyard of antiquities. They're the title pages, So he creates the title page against a backdrop as if it was present there in the scene, which of course is a creation. And so there's, these are caprices. These are inventions with fantasy. But a lot of his other engravings that you'll see, or etchings rather, that seem as if they are accurate depictions, they're not. He has changed quite a bit, and we'll see in just a couple moments other examples of that. The other thing I'd like to mention is that he says, that they were used as quarries. So these sites for these ruins were actually mined. They were seen as a mine for marble, first of all, to use for creating other monuments or structures. So especially for the Pope. So they, would dig up these marble artifacts and the leftovers of the ruins and create other structures for Christianity at the time. So from the pagan, ancient structures into new religious structures. What they did was they would take the art objects and preserve those, but the rest of them were just seen, the rest of the ruins and columns and other remains were just seen as not useful at all. So Piranesi, actually, we have him to credit for elevating the ruins themselves, not just the art objects, as objects worthy of preservation and admiration. Hence why you can go to Greece now and visit the Acropolis, and the ruins themselves are popular tourist attractions. So we have him actually to credit for that as well. You'll see, again, as I mentioned, a lot of these fictional representations, and one in particular, which is just around the corner, which we will walk by when we go into the other room, is a representation of the Via Appia in Rome, which actually was a real street, although he took all of the artifacts and condensed them into a very small space. And it's literally impossible. You know, he has all of these levels of different artifacts, funerary monuments, buildings, pyramids, all layered on top of each other, which of course was an invention. And as well as this piece right here, which I'll just touch on briefly, this is part of a large and magnificent harbor. And this is entirely a fictional creation by Piranesi, so this does not actually exist anywhere. He incorporates the classical architecture and other elements, but it's kind of like I like the description of an Atlantis rising from the sea. So you have the sea down here at the bottom with the ships and boats, and then this large classical structure just kind of looming above. So again, total fantasy in this. But still, despite all of this fantasy and invention in his work, he was still very highly regarded as the authority on Rome and classical architecture. And he created much of a name for himself, especially in England. And a famous English art historian named Horace Walpole wrote of Piranesi and encouraged those to study his work. And he said, quote, "Study the sublime dreams of Piranesi, who seemed to have conceived of visions of Rome beyond what it boasted, even in the meridian of its splendor." He says, "Piranesi has imagined scenes that would startle geometry and exhaust the Indies to realize. He piles palaces on bridges, temples on palaces, and scales heaven with mountains of edifices. Yet what taste in his boldness." So, you know, it did not go unrecognized that he was creating these fantastical scenes. But the taste is really what defines Piranesi's ambitions, to create a taste. And the taste, of course, for classical ruins, for antiquity, but also for ancient Egypt. So you'll notice throughout the exhibition, you will see relics or artifacts from ancient Egypt. And in fact, in this one, if we take a look back here, you'll see in the background here, there's actually an Egyptian obelisk, faint right here. And of course, you'll see those all over Rome, even today. And there was a reason for that as well. Why ancient Egypt? You know, we see so much of Rome, but there's no mention of Egypt in the title. Well, Piranesi was also responsible for creating this Egyptomania in the 18th century. So he also was fascinated with the ruins of Egypt and created this phenomenon at the time. So he's also mostly to credit for that. And the reason for that is that he visited Hadrian's villa outside of Rome, for which he also created some etchings in this exhibition. And Hadrian's villa incorporated ancient Egyptian artifacts. So the ancient Romans had a taste for Egyptian art as well. And Piranesi actually argued that Roman architecture and Roman beauty actually came via the Etruscans, from ancient Egypt. So with that, we'll go take another look in the next gallery at another work by Piranesi. So if you'll follow me through this way. In this gallery, we have several more engravings and of Il Campo Marzio, which is the Campus Martius. This is a site in Rome, just outside of Rome, where the most famous artifact that is there would be the Pantheon. So you'll notice some of the engravings on this wall, etchings on this wall also of Il Campo Marzio, featuring the classical ruins that were at that site in Rome. And this is also a map of the area, and he includes many of the major monuments from this site on a map. And so you have all of these spread out before you. Again, the ancient Egyptian ruins here. You see the hieroglyphs. Okay, so you see the column here, like the column of Trajan, the obelisks. So he creates this map, but there's something very significant that's going on here. And if you have already read the wall text, you would know. But he omits entirely any indication of post-classical additions to this space. So all evidence of his contemporaries is omitted. So what he's doing is actually, there's sort of a paradox here. So he's creating an imaginary space. It's in another world. So it exists neither here nor there. It's neither in the present nor in the past with all of his inventions. So he's kind of creating this very imaginary world and using a lot of artistic license to do so. And there's also some significance to that. So this leads me to my last point here, which is about Piranesi's deliberate manipulation of ruins and reformulation of the fragments from the past to create a new meaning altogether. And there has been much written about the emotional response to ruins and the manipulation of ruins and the fragments, those remains from antiquity that exist kind of inside and outside of time. There's been a lot written about this. There's a really romantic sensibility to that, which inspired later artists, many later writers and poets, including the English Romantic and picturesque tradition, which comes directly from out of Piranesi. But there's a real nostalgia and almost a melancholy quality to that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the word nostalgia was actually coined in the 18th century. And it was defined as a disease for longing for the past, which you can never recover. And there was actually a Swiss physician at the time who coined that term because there were students who were just longing for home. So homesickness was one of the first kinds of nostalgia. And so again, art historians have written a lot about this, and theorists, that there's always a melancholic longing when you are picturing ruins. You can never fully recover the past. So I do think that there is some nostalgia here. Piranesi is clearly a dreamer and a romantic. And he does two things, though. The first is that he takes the past and he makes it relevant for the present. So that's something that no previous artist had done. So there were examples of artists using classical sculptures, classical architecture, but admiring it really from a distance. Piranesi really takes it as if you are living in the past, but he also makes it relevant for the present. And you'll see that through the exhibition, especially when you see his taste for home decor. So he created lots of examples of furniture, of fireplaces, of various other items that incorporate the classical sensibility or the ancient Egyptian sensibility. And he brings it into the home. And that's significant because that's, again, the first time that there was really this new revival, and it had become almost trendy to incorporate these classical aesthetics into the home. But again, elevated for the higher classes at the time. So this is for those with really good taste, with high culture. So that's one very significant thing that he does. And the other thing is, and I'd like to kind of take this moment to say that he creates a meditation on time. So he's simply meditating on the passage of time. It's a very poetic thing, but again, the passage of time, nature, the sublimity of nature kind of growing over a lot of the ruins, the decay of ruins as time passes. It's inevitable. But that's just simply a meditation. So I'd like to say there's a distinction between that and what many other artists have done with allegory, with classical ruins. And I'll just take a side note and say that this was the topic of my graduate research, was actually allegory in contemporary art, as well as art of the 19th century, in which artists like Thomas Cole, if you're familiar with Thomas Cole, the Course of Empire, or we have some works in our collection by Eleanor Anton, who's a contemporary photographer, who creates grand Roman allegories with fragments, the ruins. But in those cases, it's usually a comment about empire. So the decline of empire, the fragility of civilization, the decadence of the Romans is often a common theme when you see allegory or ruins incorporated into an artist's work. So be conscious of that when you look at other artists of ruins. In Piranesi, that's not the case. So he's not commenting on the decadence and how it was just horrible that the Romans they were so decadent it led to the decline of their empire. Instead, it's more of a peaceful passage of time. So you do see some bones and some fragments, but the people are another important element in this. And there's been some art historical literature written in which the scale of the people in Piranesi's work is so small, and really the only significance of that is to show the grandeur of the architecture. And the other thing you'll notice is that there's always a safe distance between the people and the ruins. So you're never seeing people getting crushed by these ruins. They're never in danger. They're simply frolicking about. And as you take a closer look, you'll start to notice that. There's often little dogs, little animals running around. So the people are really interesting in Piranesi's work. And again, the Via Appia, which we passed on the way in, there's actually a Roman chariot going down the street, and it has 2 horses, and there's a person driving the chariot. So he's really playful in his use of people, and it's never a comment about death and total destruction. So I'd like you to keep in mind as you take a look through the rest of this exhibition. And with that, I believe that concludes our art stop. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your visit.
Just like, first of all,
yes.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good.